Welcome to Grappling with the Gray, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making. Help us more clearly see both sides of complex issues and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Rabbi Yonason Goldson, and I'd like to introduce my guest today. With me is Mark O'Brien, who is founder and principal at O'Brien Communications Group, a B2B brand management and marketing communications firm, and host of The Anxious Voyage, a syndicated radio show about life's trials and triumphs.
Thank you.
Jolanta Pomiotlo is Vice President of Information Technology for EXIF Worldwide, who manages innovative initiatives aimed at reducing operating costs, improving profit, and growing revenue. And Kirsten Yurich is an organizational performance management consultant, peer leaders group chair with Vistage Worldwide Incorporated, and adjunct professor of education at Felician University. Thank you all for being with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
And here is our topic. According to a recent report, median pay packages for CEOs rose to $16.3 million through 2023, up 12.6%. Meanwhile, wages and benefits netted by private sector workers rose 4.1%. At half the companies in this year's survey, it would take the worker at the middle of the company's pay scale almost 200 years to make what their CEO did. According to some metrics, the average CEO is earning 600 times more than the average employee. Back in the 1960s, the ratio was 50 to 1. Defenders of the steadily rising pay gap claim it is simple capitalism. CEOs responsible for company earnings are more in demand. Therefore, they command higher salaries. Others claim it is a symptom of crony capitalism. CEO board members vote one another higher salaries, expecting reciprocity from their peers. Whatever the true reason, the disparity strikes many non-CEOs as patently unfair. They don't expect the same salaries, but they might reasonably expect a proportionate rate of increase. The resulting resentment likely affects employee satisfaction and consequently productivity. And it also erodes trust and confidence in the system, potentially contributing to systemic instability. Is this a problem that needs to be addressed? If so, can it be addressed? If we rely on the government to enforce antitrust laws to guarantee fair practices, should the same apply with respect to salaries, or is there an intrinsic difference? How effective or consistent is government in ensuring an even playing field? And is there any alternative solution? The floor is open.
Well, as a first timer, there's about 100 questions in there.
Yeah.
So maybe that's normal.
Well, we can start anyway.
Wow.
Wow is right. You
That
know what?
brings us to the end of another episode.
If this weren't a conversation about ethics, I would say this is a matter of fairness.
Why, what's it?
And I certainly don't think government regulation is the answer because, you look at career politicians that have managed to become millionaires and more, and you have to wonder about how that came about in that corruption. And I also have to wonder, I guess I'm not sure that crony capitalism is necessarily why CEO pay keeps going up. But I do think CEOs are under pressure to produce value for their shareholders, presuming we're talking about publicly traded companies.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a little apples and oranges too, Mark, to play off of what you said. I believe there's different forces at play that determine what a CEO is paid and what your employees or your workers are paid. Right? The pools of people are different. What you're looking for is different. What you benchmark against is different. And what they're asked to do is different.
Yeah.
So I think to say, it's not fair that they're proportionally raising at the same rate. Well, fair is not equal, and anyone with more than one child knows that. So I'm not sure that that's the benchmark for, how maybe not how to solve the problem, but why to solve the problem. I think there's probably a problem to solve, but I'm not sure it's because employee salaries are not rising at the same rate.
I think so, Jonas, and one of the challenges I think in like the 80s and 90s, CEO compensation started being tied to like stock options and things of that sort. And I think because I always like why has it since the 60s or 70s, why has it risen this much, right? And it's in the 80s where we started giving CEOs stock options as an incentive to manage the corporation in a way as a shareholder, right? You want your stock options to do well. You're gonna do the right thing for the shareholders. So I think that's some of the reasons why these salaries are kind of inflated is there's a lot of base salary is one thing, but if you look at the total compensation package, a lot of it is in stock, which becomes a challenge in a sense too, because, sometimes leaders will make decisions, short-term decisions versus long-term decisions for the good of the company, because they want, the stock options have like a valuation, like let's say 5 year or whatever the arrangement is. But like, are you leading for 5 years or are you leading for this organization for its entirety, lifespan? So I think sometimes we have short-term decisions made by executive leaders because of the stock options, but I think that's why salaries are so high is because the compensation is so tightly tied with stock options and such. That's just my personal view.
I agree, Jolanta, that sometimes the shareholder goals or objectives may not align actually with the organization's goals and objectives. And so then where is the CEO making their decision if their pay or their performance and their incentives are tied to those stocks, right? They're then playing chess instead of or they're playing checkers instead of chess. I have that backwards, right? They're not playing the long game if their incentives are tied to short-term returns. So I think that is definitely one of the issues out there. And I think, sometimes they get rewarded for luck, right? Not their performance. Things can happen and it's attributed to the leader just because they're the face. It had nothing to do with the decisions that they made.
Well, that observation has been made about the presidency a number of times.
Right?
We really don't know whether the president who's in office at the moment has anything to do with the state of the economy or whether it has more to do with his predecessor. We'll be debating that one for a long time to come.
Every 4 years.
Yeah. I think another point to Jonas is it's what's interesting is I like to compare other advanced economies. So the US is one marketplace, right? So the CEOs within the United States. But if you compare to the compensation, the disparity between an average worker versus a CEO in Germany or Japan, or you will see that the US we clearly have a problem because we're the outlier. There is a disparity between, the CEO versus an average employee, but it's not that massive. So it's almost double of what is in Germany. Like an average CEO in Germany, I was looking up, is like it's half of the disparity that we have here in the US. So, and they are also advanced economies where they have stock options and global companies that operate all over the world. And so, but we have a much larger problem here in the States.
So the complexity is the pool, the market, like those variables are happening there, right? But they're past the tipping point. I was reading in a study, I think in Scandinavia, they looked at 1,500 Fortune 1,500 companies, and the tipping point for that kind of cultural negative impact of the gap is like 40-1, which we were already past in the 60s to your intro, right? And now we're well past that. So we know we have negative impact to the employees, the culture, the resentment that we're building. We're well past that.
Well, that's really, when I brought up the issue of fairness, I certainly agree with you because I have children of my own. And fairness is a nice concept,
Right.
but doesn't translate into reality too often. But even so, that perception that the system is not, I hate to use the word rigged because it's been in the headlines so often lately, but the system is unfairly tilted against the little people. Does that create a kind of instability? People aren't invested in the system. They don't believe the system is treating them fairly, so they don't feel obligated. It kind of reminds me of the doping that went on in athletics. These young guys, they'd come in, they couldn't compete unless they took steroids. And so they have a choice. I can stay in the minors and follow the rules, or I can break the rules and have a shot like everybody else. And the impact that happens on culture, I think it's hard to quantify, but I think it's extremely dangerous.
Mhm. I'll take the other side for a minute in that, there's not a lot of people that raise their hands to be a CEO. You put a lot out there, you put a lot at risk, especially these bigger companies. And, I'm probably not defending the 1600 to 1 ratio, but the 40 to 50 ratio, there's a reason why it has to be there for the sake of the people that take those jobs. Having been one, now I was a nonprofit CEO, there's not a 40 to 1 gap in the nonprofit world, I can tell you that. But there is a gap, right? And there's reasons for that. These are jobs where you are completely on all the time. Your life is under a microscope, the burnout rate, the flame out rate, right? We see it in the news all of the time. There aren't a lot of people willing to stand up and stand in those roles. And then what becomes of them when they flame out, burn out. So I think there's some value to, or there's some rationale into why that compensation looks the way it does to get people to do some of this work.
I wonder, especially when I think about employee disenchantment, I wonder what communication is like in companies that appear to be so unbalanced. There was a guy named I think he's still alive, named Jack Stack, who created this thing to save his own company, actually, called open book management.
Mhm.
And every employee in that company is fully aware of everything that's going on, including the financial standing of the company.
Mhm.
And I think if, generally speaking, if communication in organizations was more transparent, I think some of that alienation would be diminished somewhat. I also think there's a difference to be had in privately held companies, because I think privately held companies are much more likely to have a smaller disparity
Mhm.
in pay levels, because I don't know, maybe I'm naive, but I think people who own their own companies are probably more aware of that, and probably more aware and better able to take care of their people, in meaning that otherwise, if they had to report to a board of directors or something, their operating style would almost necessarily be different.
Yeah, and Kirsten, you mentioned around, not everybody might want the job, but you're right. I almost feel like today Fortune 500 CEOs are almost like celebrities. They're on the cover of Fortune, they're on the cover of Time magazine sometimes, and it's a very visible position. And I think the compensation kind of reflects a little bit of that. This is our multi-million-dollar, $16 million CEO for this corporation or that corporation. But not to say that the pay disparity should be that vast, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be 300 to 1 per se,
Right.
because the position might be justified to pay a few $1 million, but there's a point of like excess. And I do think there's a problem with you have a lot of peers on board. So obviously you want to track the same level of talent to evaluate if that talent is performing up to par. So an executive at one company might be on a board of another company, and they know what it's like to run a company, to set strategy, to set vision. So you need somebody who has that experience and that and that knowledge. But at the same time, you've got a lot of back scratching. I'll scratch your back if you scratch my back. I'll be on your board if you're on my board. And that's what creates some of these outrageous compensation packages. So I think CEOs should be properly compensated, and there should definitely be, it should be a lucrative job. You should have one of the best of the best leading an organization. But there is a point where, we could do things in a more, I'll say fair, but also just an equitable fashion too.
Yeah. When does it become the positives are starting to be less than the negatives, right? That we're starting to reach into the negatives of the impact of the company. So those individuals that work for you, they need to want to work for you. And if there's such a not just disparity, but the perception and the narrative around, we just saw all of the news around, the package for Elon Musk and in Delaware, and you have the government coming in and saying you can't have this, right? Like that's to your 98th question, I think, in your intro. Should the government come in and, and like, how do we fix it? Should they regulate that? To think that we can get a standard. I once worked for somebody who said if there weren't, for double standards, the government wouldn't have any, right? So I'm not sure the government is the right place to put it. But if we don't have any other mechanism that can work, I don't know what else there might be. Is it a place to start?
Yeah, Martin in the comments mentions the Boeing debacle. I've lost track of which one he's referring to.
Well,
and did I just
They're having quality challenges. They're having a lot of quality challenges because traditionally Boeing's leadership was very engineering focused and very safety and then they've kind of put in management that isn't so close to the details of quality and you have some of those challenges now. But
I think when you get away from your core, I'm sorry, Mark.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, didn't I read within the last day or two that Boeing launched a manned space flight? Who in the world would go on that?
I may have said that to my husband when it was being launched. I was like, did it make it? I was like really curious.
Memorial weekend.
Right? Of course. It was a couple of weeks ago. Yeah.
When we were flying to North Carolina, I said to Ann, my wife, we got to find out if that plane is made by Boeing. I mean, who would launch into space? I don't know.
Yeah, and it's sad when you have a brand that has been so universally respected and admired and led the industry for so long.
Right.
But does that go back, to your point, Kirsten, that CEO packages are linked to performance and those short-term benchmarks become the performance that they're linked to.
Baggage, right?
Then you start cutting corners to show those short-term earnings, and that's how you get into these kinds of situations.
Right.
Speaking of performance, I don't know if any of you are familiar with a gentleman named Eric Starkman. And you can find him on LinkedIn, and he writes very frequently about the auto industry. And the CEOs of GM, for one, Ford for another, are compensated very, very highly. And their performance and the performance of their companies is dubious at best.
Yeah, there's no correlation.
Yeah, that's not justifiable.
Yeah, it's just not them. Yeah. I mean, I found that also in some reading prior to this is that there's actually no evidence in the literature that there's correlation between the compensation and the performance of the company. So
yeah,
exactly what we're paying for.
Which kind of brings us back to our starting point. I have no problem that Jamie Dimon makes more money than I do, even exponentially more. I have a son who works for JP Morgan, and he loves the culture there. He got 6 weeks off for paternity leave. His boss told him it was December, and his boss told him, you can't come in for the rest of the year because you haven't taken enough of your days off, and I'll get in trouble if you don't take them.
Right.
I mean, that's the kinds of things you want to hear, that the company is doing what it can to make the company a healthy place to live. And it doesn't seem to be at the expense of profits over there. I know people have their questions about any of these big banks.
So Mark, you've mentioned the auto industry, which is interesting because when the United Auto Workers were renegotiating their recent agreement, they mentioned that. How come we haven't had a raise? And they were asking for like a 40% increase on their agreement. It's like when these bonuses and executive compensations are high, but yet we're the lifeblood of this company. We're the ones that are on that floor building these cars. So they were actually using the astronomical pay difference and the pay gap between, the ivory tower versus the day-to-day laborers as a negotiation bargaining, position, which I thought was really interesting.
And they got it, right? They got their
They did. Yeah. They got the renegotiated contract and larger increases.
And that goes out to all non-union, people reading the news. They're like, I don't get a 40%.
Uh,
So, you know, I think there's multiple levels of examples of where there's not fair changes in compensation across our categories of employment.
Do we think that, generally speaking, accountability levels are lower in larger corporations? And I'll tell you why I asked the question. We have one client that's a multinational corporation, and there is zero accountability in that organization. People can be directly tasked with things, don't do them, and there are no consequences. I don't know, is that a leadership thing or is that a size thing? I can't make up my mind.
At what level are you thinking about, or is your example at?
I'm going to suggest that it's all the way to the top,
Yeah.
because the gentleman who founded and presides over the company is, I'm given to understand, frequently made aware of what's going on, and nothing happens. And I know that there are people at the board level of that company who are quite aware of what's going on, and nothing happens.
Sounds like poor leadership.
You are what you tolerate.
Exactly right.
Yeah. I don't think it has. I think the size contributes to the opportunity for the diffusion of it, but I don't think the size causes it, would be my thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think the bigger an organization, the easier it is to slip through the cracks.
And the harder to keep those reins, right? It's
Yeah.
more people to bring in line. It's more people to get to do the, you know, the ownership and to bring into the culture and to say, this is how we do it. This is what I want from you, to have those deep, meaningful, difficult conversations. It's just more people to do it. And so you have to be more vigilant.
And I think it's especially true and perhaps especially difficult for this one company, because they literally have people all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, not only do you have that dispersion, but you have cultural issues and language.
I love that point. When you say culture issues, so I work with somebody, very large company, manufacturing, and then Japanese owned. So they're making products here in the US, and they have a Japanese expatriate, you know, CEO that comes here. And there's a real difference in how the Japanese view turnover, accountability, you know, getting rid of somebody who's not performing. That loyalty and staying with the company is much more highly prized than, is this person in the right seat? Is this person performing? Do they still belong here? Which is more of an American way of managing. And so it's very interesting to sort of watch that play out, and how you can manage $700 million manufacturing company and, right, like, sort of have two masters. Like, I have to run this, I have to create a culture, I need to have good people, and I have the secondary layer of expectation of what is good culture, what is good management. It's very daunting.
Is that in Ohio by any chance? Because I'm asking because there was actually a documentary
Oh, okay.
very much like that. Now I can't remember if it was. I think
And
it
they're
was
not making cars. By the way.
what's that?
And they're not making cars.
But there was a Japanese company that set up a plant somewhere in Ohio, and obviously wanted to hire locally.
Yeah.
The standards were just so different in terms of discipline and application. They were very disillusioned.
Yeah, and I would also throw in Europe also has a different mentality as well, right? Like, we don't have if you look at the labor laws and just, you know, the ability to fire somebody and bring a new hire at employment at will, it's a very different world in Europe as well. So it does change regionally depending on where you are.
Mm-hmm.
I do. We were talking about, Boeing, and I was just thinking of, there are some very, even though highly compensated CEOs, they're highly aspirational, kind of inspirational leaders. So if you look at like the former CEO of Southwest Airlines, like he was notoriously known to be on the ground in operations, helping to like put luggage on a luggage cart and to really understand the company, to be close to the employees, to listen to the. So I think the key is, I don't think the resentment comes from because you're getting compensated $60 million by the shareholders to do your job. I think is, how in touch are you with your organizations? Are you accessible? Are you, are you truly a people's leader? And versus, I'm just up here making decisions without truly understanding the pain points of our day-to-day business operations and day-to-day. So I personally don't think there's like a lot of resentment because one person makes X number of dollars versus another person, doesn't. But
it becomes
that,
the target.
You become a target when you're not, when you're not engaged and you're not.
Right. So my disgruntlement of your leadership gets thrust onto the pay gap.
Yes, exactly.
I think Southwest is a great example. I mean, I talk about it in my ethics training, that it's the only airline in the country that has never had an unprofitable quarter. And that's even the December before last, when they had that massive computer failure that my wife got caught in. There's something about that culture, and you can see it when you get on the plane, that the flight attendants, they're having a good time. They're showing the personality in the announcements. They seem to like working there. And, to your point exactly, that we don't mind people getting paid a lot of money when they're doing a really good job. It's when they seem to be getting a lot of pay for not doing a particularly impressive.
People care about what happens to them, right? So are my needs being met as an employee, right? Am I noticed? Am I cared about? Is my performance noticed? And am I rewarded at least appropriately? And I think when those needs aren't met, the CEO's the face. They're going to be the target. And the biggest thing that sticks out is going to be their pay.
Jolanta, when you were talking, I actually first I thought about UPS, and everybody who goes into management at UPS has to have driven a truck, which makes absolutely perfect sense to me. And then I connected that to government. And oddly enough, I happened to be thinking about that while I was in the shower this morning. How few people who make decisions in government have ever worked in the private sector.
Right.
There's a congressman, I can't remember his name, unfortunately, but I think he still owns like either a plumbing and heating business or an HVAC business or something. And during one particular hearing, he was asking somebody that he was questioning, have you ever owned a company? Have you ever worked in the private sector? And the answer was no. So, that takes me back to my conviction that this is not a situation that's going to be remediated or mitigated by government. Because I don't think there's the requisite level of understanding for most government officials, especially those who've never worked in the private sector. They just don't understand.
There's something, Mark, I completely agree. There's something special about having to have been responsible for other humans and their livelihood, right? Their ability to go home and feed their family, and you doing your job. I mean, that is an immense amount of pressure. I had, over 400 lives that I was responsible for, not the clients, the employees, right? Those are the lives that I cared most about. And those are the ones that kept me up at night. That's an immense amount of pressure. And then when you put that into thousands and tens of thousands, these bigger companies, if you haven't walked in those kinds of shoes, I think you can't do those types of those public service roles like you're speaking about.
And I'll admit, I suppose, I take great pride in the fact that in my company on my watch, I've had people grow up, get married, buy homes, have children. That's immensely rewarding. And I think maybe this goes back to the size issue. If you're in an organization so big that you're completely detached from folks like that, might be easier to lose track of what they need and want.
That's why they're guests on the Undercover Boss show.
Yeah. Yep.
You shouldn't be able to go on that show because people should know who you are, right? You shouldn't be able to go on that show and people not know who you are.
Yeah, that's true. And I also think when you were talking a moment ago, Kirsten, I was thinking, I also think it's helpful for employees to see the boss doing what the employee should be doing.
Yeah.
Again, in my company, I'm not above anything. And, I tell folks who come to work for me, you're not being paid to say yes to me. I want to know what you think.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not quite perfect yet. I'm still a work in progress.
We all are.
Yeah.
I go back to that company that you were just talking about a while ago, Mark, that the leaders will see failure to perform and not address it.
Mm-hmm.
That's mind-boggling to me.
It is mind-boggling.
I mean, yes, it's obviously a failure in leadership, but how does that happen?
And I'll give you one example.
To see I'm responsible. What goes on here? And people are not honoring their duties, their obligations, and I don't do anything about it. I don't get it.
I'll give you an example because we talked to that client just this morning. The woman that we meet with regularly is in a marketing area, but she's an accountant by training. So she does everything in Excel. She showed us a spreadsheet this morning that had 80 companies on it. And the company is now thinking, client companies, the company is now thinking they want to try to do, case studies or at least get some kind of testimonial studies. Her spreadsheet had 80 lines. She had contacted everybody listed on the spreadsheet some months ago. As of this morning, 4 responses. Mm-hmm. So the people she contacted are not responding, and the bosses of the people who are not responding are apparently doing nothing. It just makes my head spin.
It's a slow slide. Like, I think they don't go from being accountable to not accountable. It's it's one of those gradual boil the lobster kind of,
Yeah, you're right about that.
It's, yeah.
I always wonder about that or think about that when I encounter really difficult people, because I always think, what happened? Yeah. I mean, this person wasn't born like that. Mm-hmm. It evolved over time. And I don't know. I also think about the people who surrounded that person and what they tolerated and why.
Mm-hmm. I've thought about this quite a bit because it seems to be the latest trend in Hollywood. These origin stories of arch criminals. How did the Joker get to be the Joker? How did the Black Queen or the Wicked Witch of the West? How did they become so evil? And it's true that for the most part there are environmental influences, but my fear is that it always leads back to this sort of, well, everybody's a victim. Even the worst perpetrators are victims because society made them that way, and that just eliminates responsibility and accountability. And
right.
I'm not so bad because I haven't murdered lots of people.
Right. If we make that story true, there's nowhere to go. Right.
Yeah.
You can have empathy for people's struggles and at the same time have a sense of standards. Yeah.
And for every one story that looks like that, there's 100 people who had something similar happen and didn't do this, didn't go down that slide, turned it into their resiliency story.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I was just meeting with somebody and she was talking about one of her chiefs and why her team feels like she's not responding. We're almost in chaos mode, and she's just like, it's fine, it's okay, we can do all this, it's fine. And she's just so even keeled and calm. And she told me these 2 stories of, one of just being held at gunpoint and how she got through that, and one of a horrific fire and saving some children. And it's like, if she can live through those things, like, go ahead, throw some like work stuff at me, right?
Perspective.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And it's like, but if people don't know the history, they might think she's sort of laissez-faire with things that are really challenging going on at work right now. But it's like, let's put it in perspective about really how do we handle things like, I don't panic, right? I don't panic. We
Emotional
panic.
intelligence.
Yeah, yeah, just great perspective taking.
It's the old saying, if everything's important, nothing's important.
Yeah.
You know, I know people for whom everything exists on exactly the same plane of urgency. And you just can't keep up with those folks. Got any priorities around here?
Yeah, they're just dog paddling. They're not really getting very far. Under the water, they're like the duck, right? They're
Yeah,
not going very far.
yeah.
Yeah.
Jonas, and before I forget this, you were talking about steroids earlier. I happen to have a book of sports quotations, and one of my favorite ones in there is, if you told bodybuilders they could get bigger by eating Brillo pads, there wouldn't be a clean pot within 50 miles of any gym in the country. True.
Yeah, well, as somebody said, Robert Heinlein said, the longest distance between 2 points is a shortcut.
Oh, I love that.
You talk about bodybuilding. I was reading somewhere about how did Arnold Schwarzenegger become the top of the top of the top. Yeah, they said when you watched him in the gym, and everybody else is, they're all lifting the same weights, and they're all sweating, and they're all straining, and everybody else looks miserable, and he has this big smile on his face.
Enjoy it.
Yeah.
Because he had such clarity on where he wanted to be and how he was getting there. And there's nowhere, nothing else he wanted to do, nowhere else he wanted to be. It's the same thing about Jim Palmer? I think it was Jim Palmer, the baseball pitcher. They asked him how he got to be as good as he did, and he said, because everything I do is focused on that goal. And he said, if I'm at a party and I see chocolate chip cookies, and yes, I want a chocolate chip cookie, I ask myself, is that going to help me get to the level of fitness I want to be? It's not, so I go for the cottage cheese. And listen to what he said next. He said, and because that's helping me reach my goal, I enjoy the cottage cheese more than I would enjoy the cookie.
That takes a mental effort.
It's focus. It's I can't claim I'm there. But to at least recognize that kind of mindset and aspire to it.
So I think maybe we can apply that to the nominal topic of this conversation. I mean, if the thing that you're focused on is making as much money as you possibly can, then that probably explains a lot of things all the way up the chain to the CEO's enormous compensation package. Never thought about it that way before. It also opens up questions about, I don't know, balanced lives or something like that. I haven't heard people talk about the proverbial work-life balance in a while, but I have to imagine that those people who are making that kind of money may not have that kind of balance.
Question I often ask is, at what cost?
Yeah, it's a big price.
At what cost? And do you want to continue to pay it? Or do
my son, who lives in North Carolina, has a really good job with Gallagher, the enormous insurance brokerage firm. But he also has a wife and 2 kids and a home life that he loves. And he's actually turned down opportunities for raises and I can't think of the word I'm trying to think of.
Promotions.
What's that?
Promotions.
Yeah, promotions. Thank you very much. Because it will cost him that. And I suspect he might make a different decision when his kids are a little older, but not now. I admire him for that.
Yeah. I think there's a whole new generation of people doing that. I'd rather be at the baseball games for the next 10 years, and then I will do this.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'll, and God willing, if I'm still alive, I'll have plenty of time to do it.
Yeah.
Right. But if not, I spent my time where it was most important, my first vocation.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Goes back to the priorities you were talking about, Mark.
Yeah. And so I have to say it was enormously gratifying to be there with them and to see how they are with each other. How close and comfortable they are with each other.
I think your link to the topic, Mark, was really spot on in thinking about if the CEOs are chasing the dollars, then the dollars are responding, right? And that's what we're seeing, that explosion of pay. If they were chasing and I'm sure there's plenty that are chasing the value for the company, chasing the mission of the company, coming from a nonprofit world, right? I'm not sure that maybe they're chasing the same dollars. And in those, would there be a separation? Would we see some companies over here, if we think that's the contingency for some leaders, and over here, the ones that are not as sure, pay me, I want some, right? But I'm more interested in, I'm an engineer and this is the cool company and I want to do this, right? Would the ratio be different in this kind of cohort of companies? Would we see a little bit of a separation?
It's interesting you say that, because while we were chatting before we started to record, the one and only word I wrote down was value.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're right about that. 10 years or more ago, I was called to spend time at a company in Muncie, Indiana. The CEO was a guy I knew. He was having trouble finding a chief marketing officer, et cetera, et cetera. But I stayed in touch with a few of the people there, and two of them left there to start another company. And they said, we're not doing it for ourselves, and we're not doing it because we want to make a lot of money. We're doing it because we want to create a company in which our people can come to work, be recognized, rewarded, take care of their families, et cetera. And I said, you guys are going to make it. You'll succeed because your hearts are in the right place.
Right.
And they were good business people. I should add that. I mean, it wasn't a shot in the dark kind of thing.
You have to be, but your emphasis on value or values. I mean, and maybe that's part of the answer, that maybe in the 60s, the cultural values of the country were more focused on or contributing something, or producing something.
Right.
And yes, we want to make money, but there's more than just the dollar that's driving us. There's more than just the prestige and the power and the paycheck.
And not make it at the expense of.
Right. And so I'll wrap this up before we go to the second segment with a pop culture reference of my youth. When Mr. Spock says to Admiral Kirk at the time, he says, "You should never have accepted the promotion to the Admiralty, because being a captain was your first best destiny." I always like that, because there's always this push for more and more and more, and go up the ladder.
And there's a little bit of the Peter principle in Spock's quote there, isn't there?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And there are other good options. How do we make other good options for good people?
Yeah.
Wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, very, very
Oh,
much so.
Welcome. Thank you.
Mark O'Brien, especially for stepping in last minute.
Always happy to do that.
Jolanta Pomiotlo, Kirsten Yurich, pleasure. Hope you'll come back.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Join me another time. And for those who are watching and listening, if you have a topic you'd like us to take up, please go to my website, ethicsninja.com. Use the contact information, submit your idea. If it's compelling, we'll take it up on a future episode. And until then, we encourage you to continue grappling with the gray.